Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, this is your host, Manu, and I welcome you to the second edition of the Battery Show India 2024, taking the agenda of our day forward. The next on our list is a panel discussion, and the topic of discussion is India's road to electrifying its automotive sector. Steady government support as well as growing sales are driving more incumbent players to India's EV sector. In 2023, India headquartered electrified transport firms raised more than $1 billion in funding. What technical and regulatory challenges remain for electrification of mobility in India? What are the key near-term challenges? How can India position itself as a globally competitive manufacturing hub? What are the risks here? Policy pull, regulatory complexity, or customer adoption will all be covered in this discussion. And to take the discussion forward, I would like to call upon stage our esteemed moderator, Ms. Komal Karir, analyst, Bloomberg NEF. A huge round of applause for Ms. Komal Karir, ladies and gentlemen. Next, I would like to call upon stage our first panelist, Ms. Neha Jain, who's the head electric vehicles and innovation ecosystem, JSW MG Motor India Private Limited. A huge round of applause for the ladies and gentlemen. The next panelist that I would like to call upon stage is Mr. Gaurav Dolwani, who is the founder and CEO, Lyco Materials Private Limited. Mr. Gaurav Dolwani, ladies and gentlemen. The next panelist that I would like to call upon stage again for this session is none other than Dr. Andy Leach, Energy Storage Analyst, Bloomberg NEF, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Andy Leach. And last but not the least, our final panelist for this discussion, Mr. Rishabh Upadhyay, Sales Manager, South Asian and Asian Battery Materials, BASF. Mr. Rishabh Upadhyay, ladies and gentlemen. And to take this session forward, I would like to call upon stage Ms. Komal Karir. The stage is all yours, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manu. Good morning and welcome, everyone. So, as we've heard from Dr. Andy Leach earlier, lots happening in the battery manufacturing space. Here in India, we're seeing EV adoption taking off. Electric passenger vehicles are almost at the 100,000 annual sales mark. Our research at Bloomberg NEF shows that by 2030, battery demand due to rising electric vehicle adoption as well as penetration of storage in the renewable space could lead to India's annual lithium-ion battery demand to reach about 100 gigawatt hours by 2030 and almost more than double that within the next 5 years. So to discuss the ecosystem today, the developments in the industry, what industry leaders are looking at in the next short to mid-term, we have a panel of different businesses across the electric vehicle and battery supply chain. And to start off the discussion, what I'd like to do is to sort of to ask all of our panelists to kind of walk us through their experience in the industry today, what is driving their ambition specific to the Indian market, and what are their sort of learnings in this space. I'd like to kick off the discussion, Rishabh, with you. BASF is one of the world's leading materials refining and processing firms. You're now also in India. What I'd like for you to tell us is what are your plans for India? How do you see India's local battery space different from, say, the European market or the American market? Are there specific chemistries that you're more positive on in India? And do you think the unique composition of India's auto market, which is dominated by 2 and 3 wheelers, how does that inform your strategy for the country?
Thanks, Komal. Thanks for having me here, first of all. So, with regards to your question, of course, BASF has our portfolio in the NMC chemistry, But if I start with the overall BASF thought process in the battery industry, our belief is that the uh, chemistries that are there right now, mainly LFP, LMFP, NCA, NCM, LCO, they're all going to coexist. Uh, it's and then what happens is all of these chemistries find their own use cases. So you'll probably find few of the chemistries having more application into the EVs. And then even if you talk about EVs, if I take the Indian landscape, you will find that the two-wheeler segment that we find in India, it's very different what you find in China, where they're primarily driven by LFPs or even lead acid till date. But if you come to India, you are primarily looking at the NMC chemistries. If I move into the four-wheeler segment, you will see that China is primarily with NCMs. If you go to US, where you find Teslas, you will find NCAs. But when you come into India, our market is primarily driven by LFPs. So what I believe is that all these chemistries will have their own space, their own application, because if you take a two-wheeler in India, it's less of just a last mile delivery application, but more of a commute for the majority of the Indian people, where there's still affordability challenge for a four-wheeler coming in place. So that's where I think on the chemistry side, if I speak particularly about BSF, we are very confident that the NMC and the NCA chemistries that we're working on uh, are going to be demanding even in India as well. Uh, and then I believe that there's no question that LFP will also have a fair share of market. And as what Dr. Andy Leach just also mentioned, that the growth that you are looking at 25 to 30x growth, it will have enough room for all the chemistries to coexist for sure. And there will be new ones that will emerge during the time as well. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Just as a follow up there, since you're entering the Indian market, and there's lots of government subsidies, lots of government efforts to develop India's upstream manufacturing space. Do you think India's lack of raw material poses a big challenge, or let me rephrase? Do you think it's a huge drawback for battery manufacturing suppliers such as yourself? Is that a big roadblock for the country's ambitions to become the world leader in delivering competitive batteries, or is that something it should work with other countries?
Um, if you look from a mining perspective, I believe, yes, the mining industry, if I just give you a quick glimpse of the mining industry, if you take the whole mining industry globally right now, it's primarily driven by, iron and steel, right? And then you have a component of gold, aluminum, silver. And if you constitute the whole battery materials, which is lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt, they only constitute to about, around about 15% of the global mining industry. That's still a very smaller share. So if we take the bigger elephant in the room, which is the steel, you will see India is still the second largest producer of steel in the world. But it doesn't mean that we have a lot of iron ore sitting here. We also import a lot of ores from outside. Same is the case for copper. There's a lot of ores coming in. So I think, yes, if you look at from the mining perspective, we may not have a mining industry here because we don't have the ores, but certainly we do have an opportunity for refining. And if I take you back to the lithium ion industry, if we think about the lithium presence in the world, it's spread across the different continents across the globe. But if we come back to the refining industry, it's primarily located in China. So more than 90% of all the lithium is coming from the Chinese market. And why is it so? Because they had the domestic consumption, and that's why they have the lion's share in the battery. But when the demand will grow for India, I think having as we are seeing that government has a strong push of having a self-reliant dependency, especially when it comes to energy sector. I think there will be no question that there will be more refining as well as further downstream value chains within India. What we are already seeing what the government is doing, there are long-term agreements being signed up with Australia and US, where they are already securing for 20, 30 years of time frame the security of the raw material supply, especially these critical minerals for the country. And we've already seen in this budget that there has been a reduction on the import duties for these critical minerals, which actually lay the foundation for having a good refining industry for these metals within India. Yeah.
So, from what I'm hearing here, it's the government's push to develop the industry is what really driving the industry right now. To sort of change gears here a little bit, Dr. Andy, I'd like to come to you. Uh, what we're seeing in India and mostly across the globe are extremely competitive batteries, especially from China. Since you cover battery industry as your full-time job, could you tell us a bit more about where are you seeing prices in 2024, and what are the sort of the key drivers into pushing the prices where they are today?
Yeah, thank you very much. So, yeah, as I mentioned in the talk just before this, battery prices in China have fallen significantly over the last year or so. And there's a couple of different reasons. Some of them are on the supply side, some of them are on the demand side. So, on the demand side, whilst EV sales are still growing globally, it's not growing quite as much as people thought they might be, say this time last year. So there is still growth, but the growth is less than expected. So there's less demand than people are anticipating. And at the same time as that, as I mentioned, we're seeing capacities continually be built out around the world. China, the incumbent market, sort of really continuing to add to their domestic capacity. But then there's a lot of policy pushes around the world in places like India, Europe, North America to onshore capacity. So there's competing dynamics on the supply side as well. To combine that, we've seen raw material prices really fall. So lithium and nickel prices are 2 or 3 year lows at the moment. So all of these things combined have led to prices being very, very low. And this is making it a really competitive market and potentially difficult for new players.
Which brings me to my follow-up question. Are you seeing any market consolidation, especially bigger markets such as China, or is it still a fair playing field with lots of players supplying the world's battery demand?
Yeah, good question. So for sure, as I said, and the data shows, China has the vast majority of manufacturing capacity, but it also has a lot of the demand. Their market is, in general, slightly more mature. I think policy pushes are very important to try and onshore things and to try and compete with the incumbent. And I think, for example, the United States is doing quite a good job of this. They have both tariffs on importing Chinese EVs, but then they also have very strong subsidies for manufacturing batteries locally. So you want an industry to be able to sustain itself and be profitable without subsidy, but sometimes you need a push to get going. And I think that's what we're going to need. We're certainly struggling in Europe with that at the moment.
So I'm hearing a theme here, which is essentially government intervention to push the local battery manufacturing players. Gaurav, let me come to you. Your eco-materials is involved in battery recycling. What we want to understand from you is, where is the lithium-ion battery recycling industry in India today, and what is LECO Materials' role in that? What I mean to ask here is that, are you involved in shredding and preparing black mass, or do you directly source black mass and then sort of take it to the next level and process it for recycling?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. We at LICO basically are dealing with end-of-life lithium-ion batteries. The business rests on two verticals: repurposing and recycling. In terms of recycling, we are at this stage only doing up to mechanical separation, which is production of black mass. We have finalized our technology, for which we will be going downstream, where we've committed $60 million towards an investment in Karnataka, setting up a downstream facility where we'll be able to refine our black mass into battery-grade minerals. From the refurbishment side, we work with various OEMs where we are making a second life product. Overall, I think in India, the recycling industry is still a fairly young industry. We are all learning. There's a lot of learning for each one of us in our industry, purely because the kind of material that we are seeing is so varying. Uh, there's just different chemistries, different subchemistries, and different kinds of conditions. So it's a constant evolving process for us. And hence, I think every recycler here, including us at LICO, has to keep updating themselves regularly.
I'd just like to follow up there. You mentioned there's different battery chemistries that you're looking at. What is the sort of economic viability of the major battery chemistries and recycling them today? Is there lots of delta between the value that you derive after you recycle an LFP battery, say, versus an NMC battery? Or is that not particularly different?
Yeah, there's a major difference in unit economics of recycling when it comes to LFP versus NMC. In NMC, look, we are relying on different metals during recovery. So, from a commercial standpoint, there is value to be generated. In LFP, primarily you're resting on one material, which is lithium. Now, depending on where lithium prices are, it could be feasible or not. Given today's pricing of LFP, where lithium is, it's extremely challenging for any kind of recycler without any kind of EPR from extended producer responsibility, that kind of support. Now, the battery waste management rules in India have come up with a certain EPR, and the Central Pollution Control Board is working on EPR numbers. Our belief is that the environmental compensation and the EPR numbers that they have come out with today are not high enough. I think that it needs to be a higher number because we are not looking at the impact of environmental degradation.
Interesting. I'll come back to you on the policy front, but Neha, let me bring you in. You represent the demand side of the Indian EV ecosystem. MG is the second largest the second best selling electric vehicle maker in the country. When you reflect back on your market entry and now today where you are in 2024, what are the sort of 2, 3 key challenges that you faced in your journey to become the second best selling automaker? And are there any googlies that you did not expect or challenges that you underestimated? And what were those?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. So, at MG, we started our journey in India way back in 2019, and we launched our second car in the market, which was an electric vehicle. I must say, in the last 5 years, we have seen the market grow, very positively with respect to electric vehicles. And I think from MG perspective, the starting point began with creating an ecosystem of the electric vehicles first. Because when it comes to electric vehicle and the segment being so new, it is not only the product that will drive the adoption. You need to have a healthy ecosystem to support it. When I say ecosystem, that involves, say, charging infrastructure, battery, end of life management, where we have partnered with a lot of players. For example, Gaurav here again, we partnered with LICO for recycling and repurpose of EV batteries. Similarly, creating the customer experience, right education, myth busting. There are a lot of myths that everyone has about electric vehicles, the life of the battery, the performance, end of life. So, since the day one, the entire, I would say, focus was to build these meaningful partnerships, create the right kind of education and awareness, and bring about the infrastructure. So, we started with, for example, when it comes to electric vehicle, charging is first question that comes to the mind, because we are very used to going to a fuel station and get our vehicles refueled very quickly. So how to create that charging solution right from your home, to alternate solutions, like when you are traveling. So a highway charging solution, a public charging solution, a home charging solution, a community charging solution. So similarly, when it comes to battery, how to recycle, repurpose, so that EV batteries can extend their life, because batteries, especially in electric vehicle, they are so good that they can extend the life of the vehicle itself. So after that first life, how do we extend the life further? So I would say that since the beginning, this has been our motive and objective, and till date we are bringing or building this ecosystem wider and strengthening this. This year, last month itself, we launched the third electric vehicle from brand MG, and I'm very glad to share that today we are opening the bookings for it as well. So we look forward, and we hope that with more and more such enablement, people and customers can get more confidence and go forward towards the adoption.
Interesting. Congratulations on Windsors bookings
Yes.
and consumer awareness and supporting infrastructure to drive quicker EV adoption is what you're looking at. I'm going to move to the next part of the discussion, which is essentially what I want to understand from you all is your industry outlook for the respective sections of the EV supply chain that you're present in. And Rishabh, I'd like to kick it off with you. You mentioned India's partnership with Australia in order to secure raw material supply. Do you think India can become a competitive player when it comes to refining and processing of battery materials? Or do you think it's mostly the opportunity is mostly in the cell manufacturing or battery assembly space? How do you gauge these different midstream, upstream, and downstream parts of India's EV battery manufacturing space in terms of the economic opportunity and whether it's viable, whether the government's vision is viable?
So I guess you touched the very right point that we come from the vehicle side, we move back to the battery pack side, we move to the module or the cell side. So we have already seen that happening when the EVs were being launched. Multiple players in the battery pack manufacturing came into the picture, and after that there was a lot of entries into the cell. So we already seeing multiple gigafactories announcements happening here. Now, if you look at that, business, or if you look at that section, it's a huge investment. Every gigafactory boils down billions of dollars, right? And that's not an easy money to for anybody to flow in. So then, if you are there with that kind of a money, then of course you will want your suppliers uh, to be securing them by a local production as well. So I think the first stream is already happening. We are already seeing people having plans to make the electrodes, people having plans to make these separators, electrolytes in India. We have already seen some anode players coming up in India, which is the anode active material. We already have some LFP announcements within India, and the factories are being built up. And so I think that the industry will take step by step backwards on the chain. But then you will also have to understand that the more steps of the value chain that you bring in, the more stress you bring in terms of a down cycle. So if I take the picture from right now, so if you look at the Europe and the US section, and there is a slowdown in the EV market right now, you will see multiple players who are thinking not just making cars, but also making cells, also making cams, also going into refining. They are pulling back their plans on the more upstream value chain, because if you have a slowdown in the end product, you have a slowdown in your whole value chain, and the pressure on your P&L becomes too high to actually digest. So I think that's also what India will have to slowly gauge on, that from the cell we go into the cams, amps, and the different components. But do we really want to go into the recycling as of now, or we want this industry to be more mature and then take those calls? So I think if the economics make sense, it will happen into India. Like for example, if you look at the steel itself, it's such a huge consumption in India that it's impossible to have all refining sitting somewhere outside. Same is the copper and the major materials. But I think same will happen with the critical minerals as well. But a caveat on that is you will have to remember that this battery industry is essentially a global industry. You cannot be thinking that I'm going to make in India only for India. And if you look at the smaller countries in Southeast Asia, talk about Philippines and Vietnam, and I wouldn't say Vietnam is that small, but if you look at Philippines and then smaller sections of the countries in Southeast Asia, they may not be so much interested in putting up these $1 billion investments, which makes sense in India just because the sheer amount of volume. And hence you are playing a level field here. At the same time, if I'm making a cell just in India, but if I can get much cheaper from either Europe or China, it will still make sense for the EV manufacturers, for example, MG here, to of course source those materials from outside, because you're still fighting on a level playing field when it comes to the EVs. So I think that step, which goes back to the refining, will still have some time for India to decide. But I think India is very rightly taking up the right steps in, one step back on every level that we are going right now. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Rishabh. Andy, I'd like to move on to you. You showed us that there's going to be severe overcapacity issues globally as well as in India in the upcoming decade. What are the risk factors of these capacities, announced capacities, not coming online? And then, with respect to the oversupply, how will that impact the prices? We're already at the lowest levels today. Do we see prices going further lower?
Yeah, that's a great question. Will prices go any lower? I think most of the manufacturers in the room will hope not, and hope that this is as low as they get, at least for now. Some of the risk factors for that capacity coming online in the future, of course, is if there is an overcapacity and utilization rates are low, those plants are going to be operating. They're going to be struggling to operate to make money, because the assumptions that go into the modeling that we do assume a higher utilization rate than that 25% that we're showing for the rest of the market in China, for example. So it may become really difficult for players that aren't operating at the highest utilizations. They may not be able to open future capacity, and then maybe those the values in the future of overcapacity won't be quite as extreme as currently based on announcements. As I say, we're working on a way at BNEF to risk adjust that capacity, and if we apply this risk adjustment to those capacity versus demand numbers, maybe we'll see some different values, and that's some analysis I'd like to do in the future. With respect to prices going any lower, there is certainly, as I said, that there's sort of become a delineation between costs and prices, and that's where we've seen that margin coming down. So whilst it's hard to see costs getting too much lower, maybe, and we wouldn't necessarily expect, I don't know, raw materials or energy and power land costs to drop too much more, because of the oversupply, particularly in the ESS market rather than the EV market, and that's to do with the ESS market products being slightly more commoditized, being a standard chemistry, size, geometry, and have similar technical specifications. That's sort of driven those prices down, and yeah, I think most people don't want to see them go too much lower. Maybe we'll see some consolidation in the market, but yeah, it's hard to see how certainly some of the smaller players will be able to sort of do well at these low prices.
We've spoken about prices. I also want to stay with you and sort of understand from you, what is the battery chemistry mix do you see going forward? Are there any upcoming chemistries that have maybe not reached the commercialization state but could become a prominent technology going forward? And what are the factors driving your view on that?
Sure. So some of the first adopters of EVs in particular are maybe happier to pay a premium for their products. But as we see those adoption curves getting into maybe the next 10, 20, 30%, and adoption levels getting beyond that in some markets, we expect low-cost chemistries to be really important. And we already talked about LFP, and LMFP was something that you mentioned earlier. And this is something that we think will continue to be important. With respect to chemistries that we don't see so much today and maybe we'll see in the future, I think sodium ion is something which captured a lot of imagination, particularly a couple of years back when lithium prices were higher. We've seen the first sodium-ion vehicles on the road in China at the start of this year. So that is something we're starting to see penetrate the market. And of course, that has the potential to be a lower cost chemistry with sodium being cheaper than lithium, although lithium is at a particularly low point at the moment. On the other end of the spectrum, solid state batteries is something that can push energy densities higher, likely to be more of a premium product. So maybe we'll see it in vehicles that maybe have longer ranges or sort of more performance vehicles. And that's something that at BNF we're sort of cautiously optimistic about at the minute. Expect to sort of come into the market probably sometime this decade, if not early 2030s.
Thank you for that. Gaurav, you mentioned earlier that you're also into repurposing batteries. I want to dig a bit deeper on that. Are there any chemistries that are, say, more amenable to deploying them as second life batteries? Or is the opportunity more or less similar for, say, an LFP versus an NMC?
For second life, I think we are focusing mainly on energy storage. And when we look at energy storage, LFP is the preferred choice because the fact is that at the end of the day, it will give us more cycles. When we make a refurbished pack, we still need to give some kind of warranties and guarantees. That's just how the market plays out. And for that, we feel that there is with LFP, it's a one step easier process than NMC with more cycle lives and thus more longer warranty period. Also, from a safety perspective, I think LFP seems safer because in an energy storage application, you do not want to increase your costs by using extremely high tech smart BMSs, which you may need with NMC. So that's what we see primarily the difference. But there are different applications for NMC as well, especially on the cylindrical cell side, which would be more towards power banks and smaller energy storage, inverter bulbs, converting bicycles into electrical bicycles, things like that.
So, with energy storage now becoming an important part of what the government's calling the complex auctions in the renewable energy space, is that also sort of trickling down to your business for second life batteries? Are you seeing what sort of demand are you seeing from the industry for these batteries? And is there what is the sort of the economics comparison for a second life battery versus a brand new battery?
It's a good question. So I think the appetite of the market for second life is still very small in India. Also, from a manufacturer of second life batteries, we do not have consistent quantity of the same kind of batteries. So for us also to make a product that is competitive in the in the energy storage market, we need economy of scale. For that, we need the same kind of batteries in quantities so that we can automate and obviously achieve better costing. Now, when we look at the buyer side, the client side, I think there's a lot of stigma, and there are times where people say, "But this is a used battery." I don't think it should be sold as a used battery, right? It's an energy storage battery. It performs for X number of cycles, which has been guaranteed, and that's the way we should look at it. And of course, that comes at a different price point. I think the challenge always is when we are buying batteries from OEMs or from any other source, the expectations of price are always high because they have bought batteries at $200, $300, $400 a kilowatt hour. But we all know today it's roughly $50, $60 per kilowatt hour, as this presentation clearly showed. And for us to sell a refurbished pack, we need to be somewhere between $20 and $30 per kilowatt hour to compete. That means that what we can offer an OEM is lower than that. And I think that's where, there's a great sense of disappointment for OEMs.
Interesting. So, second life battery demand needs the push. Neha, let me come to you now. We've seen EV adoption concentrated for electric cars, especially in urban areas. Initial adopters are obviously people who are interested in newer technologies, but also people looking at an electric vehicle for their daily office commutes, shared mobility players. But as you look beyond these early adopters and as you move beyond the tier one metropolitan cities, what sort of strategy do you think, and whether the strategy is much different from what you've currently seen in tier one markets as you push electric vehicles to smaller cities? Um, um, you mentioned consumer awareness is low. I'm assuming that's true again for tier two markets. But are there any other challenges that you are looking at which are slightly different from your strategy in the metropolitan markets?
Actually, that's a very interesting question because as more and more people are getting to know about electric vehicles, one benefit for environment is very clear, right? Because they are zero emission vehicles. So obviously, looking at from a cleaner mobility solutions, obviously electric vehicles are the best possible solution. But I think what is very attractive for electric vehicles is also, I would say, the total cost of ownership when we see, because as a running cost, the initial purchase cost is high because the battery cost obviously has been high. But the good trend is that, as Gaurav mentioned and as Dr. Andy mentioned, the battery price is getting lower. So that means that the initial cost of purchase of electric vehicles are also seeing a downward trend. That is positive. Number one. Number two, when you talk about the total cost of ownership, we have seen that the cost of running an electric vehicle is much cheaper than a normal ICE version. Including the cost of maintenance, charging, everything, the cost of electric vehicle is less than 1 rupee per kilometer. That makes it very attractive, be it for your daily commute, and even with now new batteries, high performance, high range, it is an ideal solution for your intercity travel as well. And we are seeing how charging infrastructure is growing, and it is getting developed year on year. uh, from an MG perspective, I can share a very interesting example, like with Windsor, because there's always a question of ICE and EV price parity, and it is not there. This is what people say. So this time with Windsor, we have announced an industry first offer, which is called BAS, Battery as a Service. So with this initiative, what we have tried to do is to de-link the cost of the vehicle and cost of battery. So basically, you can own the vehicle, but you can own the battery on a rental, and that brings the cost of the vehicle at par with the ICE car. So this is a very innovative and a new concept, and we have seen a very good, I would say, traction around it as well. This is the first time ever. But again, initiatives like these are with the intention that to bring those challenges, or I would say answer those challenges and encourage people to buy more and more electric vehicles.
As a follow up on your battery as a service model, just a couple of things there. The leasing rate, is this constant for both private customers as well as shared mobility players, or are there different sort of models when it comes to per kilometer charge that you impose? And also, is the app daily, the minimum driving range, is that similar for private and shared mobility players, or are those metrics different for different customer segments?
So see, the daily usage is obviously different for a private customer versus a commercial or a fleet usage. BAS as a model right now, we have introduced, this is for the individual usage. And here again, there are multiple options, like which has a minimum usage or zero usage even, because we have partnered with different players in the financing sector as well to offer a very customized and very need based kind of a solution to the customer. So there are multiple partners that we have tied up, and they have offered different solutions to this. As far as fleet operators or fleet companies are concerned, their financing models are different because the usage, the kind of usage they do is very heavy compared to an individual users. So here the idea was, as an individual, so in a fleet, the cost of ownership, or I would say the running cost, actually suits the business because of the high average. But for an individual customer, the cost of purchase were becoming high. because that upfront battery cost you are paying at the time of purchase of vehicle. So with introduction of models like BAS, this will help to reduce the initial cost of ownership and would try to bring the parity between the cost of electric vehicles and ICE.
Interesting. I'd like to bring back Mr. Peterson. Earlier mentioned CNG and hybrid being potential competitors to electric vehicles. How are you seeing that as a potential competition? I think especially when it comes to refueling infrastructure, uh, especially intercity drives are much harder with an electric vehicle. CNG refueling stations, the government is rapidly expanding them, although infrastructure outside of cities is still under development. And then hybrids for your daily commutes, the efficiency is the biggest selling point. How are you sort of evaluating these different technologies against each other?
Uh, See, when it comes to India market, the penetration of electric vehicle till today is approximately 2%. So even with lot of, I would say, technologies, hybrid or others coming together, it's actually the competition scenario does not exist till now, because with a 2% market share, I think there's enough room for different kind of solutions to coexist in the market. Secondly, yes, this also brings different choices to the consumer. When it comes to electric vehicles especially, I clearly think that when we are talking about energy independence as a country, electric vehicles play a huge role, because that brings our dependence on the fossil fuels to zero. Hybrids or other technologies, obviously they are not fully battery, I mean, obviously there's some battery, but there's not 100% battery enabled vehicles. So EVs bring a very good solution when it comes to energy independence, and with India investing a lot on renewable energy share, so here the electricity is becoming green as more and more percentage, and infrastructure is getting developed, like I said. So put all of this together, so we see that all these technologies can also coexist and gives different options to the customer when it comes to their option.
Interesting. Customer choice ultimately will decide which of these technologies wins out. I'd like to close the panel with the last round focused on conversations around policies for EV infrastructure in India. But before I jump into the India specific policies, the pros and cons, the challenges, what more can be improved, what is the country doing well, I'd like to, Andy, first come to you and sort of help ask you to help us understand what are other countries doing well. We've seen comprehensive industrial policies with respect to developing the EV ecosystem in China and now the US. What are some lessons in policy making India can take away from some of these success stories across the globe?
I think comparing what's going on in Europe at the moment and the US is a good place to look. In Europe, there are tariffs on EVs coming in, but the subsidies for local manufacture of batteries are on a project by project, company by company basis. And as we've seen, it's been really tricky market in Europe recently. So ACC in France, PowerCo in Germany, and Northvolt in Sweden, some of the sort of companies with bigger plans in the region, or homegrown companies with bigger plans, really struggling. If we compare that to what the US is doing, they have the import tariffs coming in for Chinese EVs and other sort of components, but then they also have really significant local manufacturing subsidies, so $35 a kilowatt hour at the cell level and $45 a kilowatt hour at the pack level. And this combination of both trade barriers or tariffs with very strong local subsidies is doing more to sort of help the local companies there, I think. So I think it's, as I say, industries should eventually be self-sustaining and profitable, but when you're sort of competing against a very influential and powerful incumbent like the Chinese battery industry and EV ecosystem in its entirety, you do need a bit of a help to get there. So I think things like the auto PLI and the battery PLI here in India, as well as I know that there are some sort of reductions on tariffs at the minute for importing battery cells, for example, but they're due to expire in 2026. So it'd be interesting to see what the Indian government does at that point if those tariffs start to increase. And I think to really support local industry, that would be important.
Interesting. Rishabh, what is your view? Andy mentioned PLI schemes. Do you think those are sufficient? Should they be implemented for longer? Or do you think by the time we reach the end of their implementation period, battery prices will be low enough for the industry to sustain itself?
Uh, Sorry, Komal, couldn't get your complete question, but what I understood is you said whether the PLI scheme would be sufficient and or there will be something else which will be required further. In my view, I think the reason for subsidies, I think it's very clear. You are playing in a field where three countries actually pioneered and walked way ahead. So if we talk about Japan, Korea, and China, they've already mastered these technologies in a way. If we compare the scale that we have either in Europe, India, or US, and that's where you will see subsidies coming in primarily in these countries. So you will see Southeast Asia and in the Indian subcontinent having these subsidies, Europe trying to make subsidies, and the US. The reason behind putting subsidies from the governments is to give a level playing field for the domestic players. So I think there will be subsidies required, like PLI, for some time. But at the same time, I think Indian government specifically, and more other governments are taking this smart move of ensuring when to move away from the subsidies, because a business at the end has to be self-sustaining, right? If you're only dependent on the subsidies and if the subsidies go away, it becomes very difficult for you to actually sustain that market going forward. And I think that's a smart move. So that's why if you look at the new scheme which came after the FAME 2, you saw that there was no two-wheelers included in there, because I think we sort of gauged that two-wheeler market, and we have now moved in with a couple of players. More ICE vehicle players are also moving into the two-wheeler segments. We see cell manufacturing coming up on board, but I think four-wheelers, and then as the previous speaker was speaking, that the heavier vehicles, the buses and the trucks, the penetration is very low there. So even in four-wheelers, we are just at 2%. In two-wheelers, we are at 6%. If you go to the buses, it's less than 1%. So hence, it becomes important to subsidize those things over there. At the same time, as what Dr. Andy mentioned, that the scales at which China is manufacturing, it's way higher. And then in the present scenario, when there are so much overcapacity sitting on there, it makes them very easy for making that decision to actually flood the market in India, and hence ensuring that we get these ACC PLI schemes, giving some comfort to the local manufacturers to actually set up their shop and learn their trade before they actually remain competitive is essential. So these subsidies will be required for bringing the business to a certain level, but I think this whole model has to be self-sustainable in going forward, which I'm pretty confident that it will do. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. I can see that I'm running out of time. So, Gaurav, very quickly, what's one thing, if you could ask the government to offer battery recycling companies, what's one thing that you think could help you take your business forward? I know you mentioned EPR rules are not really at par with what the industry needs right now, but what is that policy?
Look, recycling is at the bottom of the chain, right? So we are the the absolute last guys. So whether it's the PLI has been introduced for cells, but that has to go across the board through battery materials all the way to recycling. So we would definitely request for, and we have been for capital incentives for setting up recycling capacities. But of course, for at the moment, short term, I think the focus is on environmental compensation and EPR rates, because today we are at 5 to 6 times lower than what Europe has implemented, and I think that itself, tells you that this is not a level playing field for a recycler.
Interesting. Thank you. Neha, to you. The PLI manufacturing subsidies, are those enough? Or are the local content requirements harder than anticipated to reach?
So I can say all these support is definitely helpful in increasing the adoption of the electric vehicles. We are seeing a lot of demand and supply side both incentives at the center level and at the state level as well. More and more, I would say, clarity on ground of such incentives and everything definitely help the consumers to adopt more electric vehicles. And I think if this continues, this will definitely help to boost the adoption.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I can't hand it over to the audience for the questions. But you know who the panelists are. Please grab them once they're off stage to clear if you have any questions. Thank you very much, Manu. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Komal. That was a very astute observation that you all made today here, and the discussion was very insightful and informative. I am definitely more informed and have more knowledge at hand as far as India's road to electrifying its automotive sector is concerned. So I would like to thank the entire panel once again with a huge round of applause, please, ladies and gentlemen. Let's be generous when we are clapping for people who are working hard. And now, to show our appreciation to everyone here, I would request our moderator, the beautiful moderator, Ms. Komal Karir, to please present mementos to the panelists. The first panelist that we would like to felicitate is Ms. Neha Jain. Please come in the center so that we can get beautiful photographs of both the ladies. The next panelist that I would request to please come forward is Mr. Gaurav Dolwani. Thank you so much. And then now I would request our panelist, Mr. Rishabh Upadhyay, to please come forward. And finally, I would request Dr. Andy Leach to please come forward and present the memento to our lovely moderator, Ms. Komal Karir, as Dr. Andy was already there with us in the last session. So